Welcome to the Acquivore podcast, episode 3. My name is Don Mansfield from Don Acquisition LLC. I'm joined by Nick Sanders and Jennifer Townsend. And this week we're going to talk about current events and the contracting in the time of coronavirus. Um, First, before we get to that, I want to tell you a little bit about Don Acquisition. Don Acquisition is a federal acquisition training company. We have courses in simplified acquisition procedures, the DFARS, and our website is donacquisition.com. We have other courses that are available, such as the FAR DFARS subcontract flowdown course. Learn how to flow down the proper clauses to your subcontractors. The comparative contracting methods course, the contract administration course, and the small business programs course. So check out my website and hope to hear from you. Jennifer, can you tell us about contracting
My
courses?
Sure. My name is Jennifer Townsend, and I just recently quit working for the government and decided I was going to start training because that's where my true love is, and I'm nerdy enough to devour the FAR. So I offer two courses right now. Currently, the first one is on contracting clauses, just the FAR clauses to start with, because that's more than enough for one class. And then the other course is on commercial contracting from a holistic viewpoint, covering not just the differences in pre-award procedures, but also the differences in post-award liability and what it actually means from a risk standpoint for the government to choose to go commercial, and also what the contractor is signing up to that's different from the standard government non-commercial approach. So those are my current two courses, and my website is contractingcourses.com.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. Let's hear from Nick. I'm just going to unmute you, Nick. Go ahead, Nick.
Hi, it's Nick Sanders, and I run Apogee Consulting Incorporated, a small boutique contractor that helps businesses who do sell or want to sell to the federal government with a lot of the back office administrative issues, accounting, pricing, billing, audit support, resolving disputes without having to go to court would be a good thing that I do. And I've been doing it for a while. And I would say that in contrast to Don and Jennifer, I have never worked for the government. I've only worked at a bunch of contractors in interesting industries. And now I'm most familiar with the defense industry, but before that was environmental remediation and construction. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Nick. So, along with the pandemic, there's been a lot of changes in how the government's doing contracting, and as you can imagine, it's in the news. So Jennifer's picked out some articles here for us to discuss, and the first one has to do with a fraud case in N95 contracts. You want to talk to us about that, Jennifer?
Yes, I do. I'm always very interested when I see contracting in the news, and in this particular case, um, there was a couple of, well, actually a whole bunch of articles, but this one I think is interesting because it highlights, because I think the coronavirus and the government's response to it has been primarily in three different waves, I guess, so to speak. I don't know what other word to use for it. But initially, the government had the same issues as I think everybody else did, which is how do we get masks and personal protective equipment for our employees? What do we do in terms of just continuing to try and operate business as normal. There were a number of issues about, are these excusable delays, that contractors were experiencing? But that was far too technical to get into all in one podcast. So the government did, just like everybody else, strive to buy large amounts of personal protective equipment for its employees. And this part, I think, is unclear from some of these articles, whether they were intending on, sharing some of these items with the public or with healthcare workers or whatever. So in this particular case, this is they were trying to buy N95 masks, the masks that had the top particulate filtration. And in this particular case, it was a Veterans Affairs contract, which isn't actually that surprising. Typically, the Veterans Affairs does operate most of the medical supply contracts for at least DoD and other parties in the federal government. I think what was surprising is this particular contractor didn't actually have the masks in stock, and I think was trying to source them. Hopefully I'm not sure I'm getting, I want to be sure I'm not getting my articles confused, but he was trying to source them from China, which was a violation of the Buy American Act. And I actually looked up in the VA regulations just to be sure. I was like, well, do they have an exception if someone's a veteran to, buying something from China? And they don't. This item would still be subject to the Buy American Act, still subject to, especially if there's preferential treatment for veteran-owned small business, still subject to the restrictions of the non-manufacturer rule. So it appears that none of those things were actually well, I shouldn't say that. They could have been investigated ahead of time, but chances are they weren't, primarily because contracting officers don't typically investigate where the item is being sourced from in advance. They just rely on the offerer's representation that they are coming from America, or that they have the actual items, or that they are, in fact, a service-disabled veteran-owned small business. And in this case, the contractor didn't actually have the masks, wasn't able to supply the masks, and even though he was awarded the contract, ended up not delivering. And I presume, depending on how they did it, it was 34.5 million. And so clearly this was not simplified acquisition procedures. Correct me if I'm wrong, but even if they invoke the emergency thresholds under FAR Part 12,
No, it doesn't go up that high.
Yeah, I didn't think it did. And so I'm guessing they were using some combination of 12 and 15, FAR Part 12 and 15. So they couldn't just cancel, like maybe they canceled or terminated the contract. So the government in this case didn't actually lose any money, but it certainly raises a specter of issues that I think are very commonplace in emergency contracting. I mean, I always follow with interest the government's contractual response to any kind of emergency situation, the hurricanes and so on and so forth. And I think many instances you have actually very similar stories, FEMA, and I think most of these issues are very interesting, such as what actually is the government's role in natural disasters or in this pandemic. Typically, medically speaking, the federal government is not a first responder by any stretch of the imagination. Medically speaking, the typical, and I think it's still this way, is primarily state and local governments and hospitals and private medical institutions that deal with these types of things. So I think and I think we'll be dissecting these issues actually post-pandemic for years to come, which is, is it the federal government's job to step in? And certainly when something reaches a national impact like this did, and maybe you guys could, because what are the national medical agencies or Department of Health and Human Services, Veterans Affairs, Veterans Administration, and then the Centers for Disease Control and National Institutes of Health, I guess. What else is there? Am I missing any medical ones?
No, I think that's right. I think they're all part of, well, CDC is part of HHS, right? And I think National Institutes of Health is too. Um, yeah.
Nick is saying something, but he's on mute.
Oh, sorry. Hey, Nick, you were muted.
I was muted.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can
Is
you-
it something I said?
No. It's just when Jennifer's talking, there's some feedback. So go ahead. What were you saying?
Jennifer, okay. I'm going to ask my question again. I apologize for the mutation. How was this proposed contractor determined to be presently responsible and have the wherewithal to swing $30 million of N95 masks? Forget the sourcing. Like, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
Did anyone ask him, do you have the financial capability?
Yeah, I mean that's my initial
Do we
reaction
know?
too. Is where was the responsibility determination?
Well, my
Yeah.
experience recently, and in several locations, is that after DoD, not just DoD, but after the fairly elaborate pre-award surveys were kind of done away with, for various reasons, because of the delay that it was contributing towards contract award, as well as this idea that, well, the internet has so much readily available information that we don't need to do pre-award surveys anymore. We can just readily find out. People were not, even in DoD, which I think has a reputation for being fairly stringent in terms of file documentation, they were not doing actually any kind of positive responsibility determination. What the FAR says is that responsibility determination is made by the contracting officer's signature on the document. Whether there's any file documentation or any actual research done to back that up is a whole separate issue. And I think that is, in my opinion, that is one of the single biggest weaknesses in the federal government today in terms of procurement contracting, especially as we've swung more commercial and tried to shorten that time frame, is we're not within the field doing our due diligence to validate that people that we award contracts to, or firms that we award contracts to, can in fact actually deliver as they've indicated. Clearly, and this one I think is very interesting, because I think in the article it says that he actually contacted the VA. So it appears that he wasn't necessarily responding to an open solicitation. And so he basically contacted the VA and said, hey, I've got tons of these masks and let me sell them to you. But he didn't actually have any of the masks. And and he'd never received a contract before. And then he was led astray by an unnamed third party. And so, someone, who knows, I'm kind of reading between the lines here, but someone approached him and was like, hey, you probably qualify for service disabled veteran status, and we can really go to town in this case. And I think there is some degree of truth to the fact that when you are using preferential treatment, particularly under various congressional mandates, such as Veterans First, or any of the small business acts, the responsibility determination is not necessarily as robust as it might be otherwise. I mean, certainly with an 8A, the responsibility determination is done by the SBA, and so the SBA is the one saying that the firm is responsible, whether they are or they aren't. And there are a number of 8A terminations where the firm ended up not being responsible, even though the SBA in theory had validated that they were. So I think there's a number of issues. So yes, the lack of responsibility determination, the lack of apparently competitively even announcing this, and there's a couple of other articles which Don hasn't pulled up because there's a couple of other issues still to discuss in relation to this coronavirus response. But a couple of other articles about how the government was buying ventilators as part of their first response, which I think is also extremely interesting because I presume they were buying the ventilators for the actual government use, like as in veterans hospitals or actual DoD hospitals. That part was never clear. But they invoked various Defense Production Act rules to have, I think, some of the automakers, if I remember correctly, Ford, the Ford vehicle company, converted some of what they were doing to processing ventilators, manufacturing ventilators. And again, still very unclear. And I think that when procurement professionals read general news articles on government contracts, we get a little bit frustrated because it's lacking in some of the procurement technical details that would make it clear. But it's very unclear where these ventilators were going to be used. It's very unclear if any of these Ford ventilators were delivered to, say, hospitals at the state and local level. All of that was still very unclear. But I think it highlights a number of issues, is that when you are a government procurement official, and if you work for the government in procurement, as a procurement contractor, whenever there is some kind of national or, disaster or even wartime contracts, there will be mistakes made. But I think the rush to throw the rules out to respond to something is it's a lose-lose situation in my mind. I mean, when they bought the trailers after Hurricane Katrina is another, prime example. You just can't throw the rules out and just start buying willy-nilly, because inevitably stuff like this happens, and it happens at a higher exponentially higher rate than it might otherwise. So before we move on to the next topic, I'll ask Dawn and Nick to weigh in.
Nick.
All right. Well, first of all, my first reaction is N95 masks are going to be commercial items. How are they not going to be commercial items, right? So what I learned tonight is the Buy American Act extends to commercial items. Should it? Right? Is that an artificial constraint the federal government is putting on its contracting officers when they just want to go out and buy what the market has to offer? If Chinese source masks are what's in the market, like when I go to Target, a lot of stuff comes from China. Why would this be any different? If this is truly a commercial item, why do we care where it comes from? Right? So that's my first reaction. My second reaction is I want to tell a story. Back in the 90s, I worked at a company that had something to do with the LA Metro dig, right? They were digging the subways under Los Angeles. And the story went around that they were bidding the next section of the subway tunneling, and the bids were coming in at $1.5 billion, $1.6 billion, $1.7 billion, and somebody came in at $350,000. So obviously a mistake. So the contracting officer called the person up and said, did you skip a zero? No, we can do it for $350,000 was the answer. Well, how can you do it for $350,000 when all these other companies are talking north of $1 billion? I said, yeah, well, me and my cousin Ed, we're going to dig the tunnels. What? Yeah, Ed's going to start on one side. I'm going to start on the other. We'll meet in the middle. You'll have a tunnel, $350,000. Well, needless to say, it didn't quite meet the quality standards the subway digging people had in mind. But that's the point of the story, is This guy says he's got $30 million of masks, and nobody said, well, are they functional? And the same story about the ventilators. I got all these ventilators, let me sell them to you. Do they work? That would have seemed to be a very, rational question to have asked. Those are my comments.
Yeah, I kind of thought about, where was the due diligence here? I do think that responsibility checks have kind of become a rubber stamp. Um, I think it's like one more thing to do right before award, and they don't do pre-award surveys as much as they used to. Probably should. This story kind of reminded me of War Dogs. Did you see that movie?
I have not.
Yeah.
War Dogs or Deal of the
It's
Century?
called War Dogs. It's about
Okay.
these guys who want a contract to supply bullets or ammunition in Iraq.
Oh, yeah,
And,
yeah.
they did have a supplier, but all the stuff was, I believe, made in China. So they didn't discover that until after they won the award. But, they did show how they went to Rock Island, Illinois, and spoke to the review team and were determined responsible. So they falsified a lot of documents in order to do that, like fake invoices and stuff like that. So they got in trouble for that. But in this case, all the guy did was say he could do it, right? Um, and his lawyer is saying that at the time he said that he thought he could, right? That probably happens every day in contracting, right? In government contracts, people think they can perform. There's one side that gets the contract, and then the other side executes the contract. Um, so I don't know. I think, yeah, it's not. They're kind of making it look like the contractor's the bad guy, but I think someone on the government side didn't do their job.
But what could they have done, Don?
Well, I guess what I would have done is at least if they'd never done contracts with the government before, I would have asked for a pre-award survey.
Well, what about this? What about they evaluated past performance, but because there was no past performance, they had to give them a neutral rating,
Okay.
right? Can't isn't it at the point now where if you don't have past performance, there ought to be some like additional questioning going on, not just, oh, a neutral rating. That's
Okay,
neutral.
but you could still get them for not having experience. Just because,
Yes. If it's a solicitation, if there was a competition.
but even for responsibility, one of the standards of responsibility is that they have adequate experience. Right?
Yeah, and the other one is adequate financial
Yep.
capability to actually, buy the mask without needing advance payments. But for all I know, the contractor said, I'll need advance payments. Why wouldn't you give them advance payments? They got
Yeah.
masked.
Well,
I got to go down. I got to go south of the border and get them.
it's unclear. I mean, I don't think you can do advance payments in commercial contracting, certainly not typically for items of supply, which these are. In theory, he should have been entitled to delivery payments. So, if he say that he delivered 1 million masks, he should have been entitled to get paid for 1 million of those. It's unclear without the contract number exactly like what kind of terms were available there. But I think I absolutely agree that the government should have done a little bit more due diligence. I mean, certainly at this point in time, it was quite clear that N95 masks were not readily available. That people, I think during the time period that this was happening, there were news articles about medical people reusing the same mask, because they just were running out of this level of masks. And so I think, again, had the average 1102 been asked to buy these masks, and hopefully they would read the news, they would try and do some sort of validation of do you in fact actually have these masks. But I don't think that actually occurred. So yeah, I think there was a number of issues raised there. I think there was a couple of other stories, not in this particular article, but I think USA Today carried a couple of other stories where they were indicating that this particular firm was not the only one to do something along these lines. There was a couple of other people who also represented that they sold masks, and they had websites where they quickly popped up N95 masks or hand sanitizers or, ventilators or something of that sort, and in some cases did significant markups, reached out to the government, and they were basically acting as middlemen between, either China or Taiwan. They were sourcing them from overseas, they were misrepresenting things, and they weren't understanding some of the compliance issues that are associated with this. Again, how often does that happen where something from China gets delivered and somebody from the government accepts it and nobody even really questions whether it was, Buy American Act compliant or not? But again, I think some of these issues, when it is a pandemic or something like that, and the government rushes to buy, and then suddenly comes out that they've paid, I think 3M did a significant markup on their N95 masks when they wrote. There was an IDIQ, I think, written to 3M. Post some of this initial wave, and there was a significant markup on their N95 masks under that particular contract also. So I think the lesson and the takeaway certainly for government procurement personnel is don't presume that simply because it's a pandemic that due diligence is not required, that you shouldn't, you still need to do that due diligence, and it shouldn't be a roadblock to, it shouldn't, a couple of hours of delay or even a couple of days of delay is worth validating, because what happened here, they thought they had bought 6 million masks. And at what point did they discover they had not bought 6 million masks? Clearly, a little bit of due diligence up front might have caused 1 or 2 days of delay, but it would have saved a completely misawarded contract and, false idea that 6 million masks are going to be delivered imminently, and then some discovery that, oh no, they're not delivered.
Mm.
So let's move on to the next wave. So the government also then initiated Operation Warp Speed. And this was to warp speed vaccine development through, it was to develop vaccines and obtain approval as quickly as possible. Now, the obtaining approval as quickly as possible, I think, did in fact occur. I'm not an expert on the regulations to obtain vaccine approval, but it was very interesting to me that the government actually awarded a number of contracts to develop these vaccines. And I think there's still a lack of clarity about, I guess the government is paying for the vaccines. I'm not even remotely close to being on the qualify for a vaccine list yet. So it's unclear to me, but I believe vaccines are being given for free to every U.S. citizen who qualifies for one under these contracts. And so what was interesting though, is they did issue billions of dollars worth of contracts to various companies, but they did it, and Don's got the point highlighted there, they did it through a non-government intermediary. So essentially what they did is they awarded a large contract to this Advanced Technologies International Incorporated, who then awarded subcontracts to Moderna, Novavax, these other firms. And
So
so
was it an
because
other
of that,
transaction?
that part is not clear. It was either another transaction or they did it. They didn't do it through. I mean, there was a number of not abnormal things. They somehow invoked the Defense Production Act again. And somehow DOD was involved in awarding this contract, even though it was Department of Health and Human Services. And so the newspapers, of course, were very interested in this. And so what they did is they went and tried to do a Freedom of Information Act request for the contracts, and Department of Health and Human Services came back and said, we have no contract. And so then they would have to go to DOD and try and do a FOIA request to DOD, which it's not, I think the way they found out about most of these contracts, there's a couple of articles, is that these firms then did their SEC filings, their earnings statements, and disclosed that they've been awarded these, billion-dollar contracts. And so that was how these contracts came to light, which certainly does not comport with the Competition and Contracting Act. It certainly doesn't comport with even merit-based competitive procedures in the assistance world. It doesn't seem to comport with any of those types of things. Having said that, is a nationwide pandemic, if there ever is a time to kind of, invoke some flexibilities and do things that aren't normal, I think a nationwide pandemic that has ground the economy to a halt and caused a number of issues, I think those things are, it is the time to perhaps do that. So yeah, I guess this is an OTA. Is that what it says?
Well, it's saying in general, in special cases, the government has been turning to an alternative mechanism called an other transaction agreement.
But I don't know
Uh,
that they did. I think it's unclear what they
yeah.
did still. I don't think they ever necessarily got a contract number. They just somehow found out that it was through this intermediary. Um, a couple of the articles point out that none of these contracts now are subject to FOIA because they are subcontracts at best. Um, I think they are subcontracts. I don't think that they were a consortium of any kind. I mean, there was no legal entity put together. And so it was certainly, I mean, there's no clear indication of what exactly happened here. No clear indication of how much of the R&D is being paid for by the government, how much is being paid for per vaccine. I mean, just a complete lack of clarity. It talks about the Bayh-Dole clauses, which are government intellectual property clauses, and it does talk about how it's not clear what patent rights the government has to these vaccines, if any, even though the government paid for the development and is buying them. So even after these initial contracts expire, it's quite possible that the intellectual property for these billions of dollars worth of things is not going to reside anywhere close to the government. So just a number of very interesting issues through this very vague, unclear warp speed situation. So what do you guys have to say about that aspect?
Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I mean, I think At the time, it probably made sense to somebody to do that this way. I'm struggling now in hindsight to figure out why awarding to a prime who would then subcontract billions of dollars was the right decision. I don't get why that would ever be the right decision, unless you wanted to hide something intentionally, and I don't know what was trying to be hid. But I try to give them the benefit of the doubt. There was a panic. It's the same thing with the masks we just talked about. At the time, we couldn't get toilet paper in stores. I mean, there was a definite sense of catastrophe, panic, right? So maybe this made sense to somebody at the time. I hope, without making a witch hunt out of it, that the truth comes out eventually about what the story is. Who is this middleman company? How much of a markup are they making? I think there's a lot of questions, but at this point, all we have are indications that maybe this made sense at the time, but in hindsight, probably not the way to go about doing it for exactly what you said, Jennifer, not the least of which is the intellectual property. If the government, and we're going to talk about this, I hope, before we conclude tonight with respect to the vaccine management database story. If the government is so bad of a buyer that it won't take intellectual property that it paid for, I gotta say, we should get different people doing the buying. So that's what I have to say about this one. It's just, I don't know enough to be outraged, but I think it was going to be a bad story later on.
So it looks like it was an OTA. It says, ATI manages contracts and facilitates dealings with the government for several consortia of academics, companies, and more using OTAs. You know what's interesting, what I find interesting about this is these types of entities would not exist would it not be for the way the statute is written for OTAs. Because the statute talks about like being part of a consortium, and but at the time the statute was written, some of those existed, but it didn't breed these types of entities that they're basically doing the government's job, like what this guy was saying. He says he didn't know that he was working on Operation Warp Speed.
Well, I think it's also that this firm is a nonprofit, which of course can mean a number of things, but typically the big showstopper for an OTA with a firm like Novavax or whatever would be that you don't do OTAs with for-profit firms. And so a lot of the large defense firms went ahead and set up a branch that was nonprofit so they could qualify for OTAs. And I think that that's part of what was happening here is this nonprofit. But I think it's pretty clear from the article too that they expanded their existing consortium. They were approached, like it sounds like DoD approached the firm and was like, "Hey, can you expand your consortium to include Novavax?" Basically they just listed who they wanted to award to, and that's how it appears to have happened.
Yeah, it says, it's a quote from ATI. It says, so the government then asks us to actually run a competition very similar to what the government would run within the membership of the consortia. ATI's job is to put out a request for proposals, collect the essential information, make sure they're all in the same format, and send them to the federal government for evaluation. It seems to me like
it's a personal services. It's a personal service contract. What is that?
I kind of see it as I think you have somebody who's responsible for this in the agency, and they're looking to get things done the most efficient way possible. And most likely their experience with their contracting department has not been good. They've not seen it as, they get the FAR thrown at them. So they're like, all right, well, we'll do this instead of the FAR. I've seen this, in other places too. I remember when OTAs started becoming popular again, a lot of the program people at DAU were all, you know, gaga over OTAs. And what they thought is it necessarily saved time. Um, but there's nothing about an OTA that makes it faster. You can go fast under the FAR if you know what you're doing. There's a lot of authorities in the FAR that let you go fast. Um, so I think, I can see why this happened. They're being pragmatic. Um, but I think it doesn't look good for contracting people or, the typical contracts people who are, supporting this, that they can't go fast.
Well, and it certainly is not the typical model of an OTA. I mean, the whole point of an OTA was to attract traditional non-defense types of, contractors to DoD to take advantage of technology or things that might be out there. Maybe also to try and, I mean, in theory, to circumvent, I mean, I think there was some of this, it was to actually circumvent some of the intellectual property provisions that were typical for the FAR. I think there was some lobbying from industry to do that. But it certainly wasn't to award an OTA to an intermediary who would then essentially award their own OTAs, which are, under contract law, these are contracts, they're actual contracts that were awarded to these firms, with government funds. So yeah, it is. And I mean, to me, this is kind of a shady. It's certainly not the traditional idea of what an OTA is supposed to be about. And I think you could have invoked other flexibilities in the FAR, like unusual and compelling urgency. I mean, it's hard. It is hard to make a case. I said this out of my mouth a number of times that research and development would almost never qualify for unusual and compelling urgency. But I certainly think that, in a nationwide pandemic, that might be the time that you could make a somewhat compelling case for that. So I think there were ways to do this, that it still could have been done with a little more thought to prudent expenditure of
Yeah.
taxpayer funds, I guess.
Yeah.
You know what the real benefit of an OTA is from a contractor perspective?
No cash, no.
A lot of the critics go away. A lot of the critics go away in an OTA. You don't get DCA coming in to do cost
Yeah.
audits. You don't get the IG. You don't get the IG saying your CAFU database wasn't updated and you didn't disposition and you didn't have the cost surveillance and monitoring you should have had as a contracting officer. So in the post-award administration, I would imagine it's very attractive. But I think Don's got the correct point. It's no faster to get the award than you could do other things. And Jennifer, you said the same thing. There's lots of ways to get the job done quick if you want to. But doing it this way, a lot of the scrutiny in the post-award world was taken away.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to end well with OTAs. I think we're going to see some reports from GAO or IGs where,
I totally agree with Don. It's like whenever you start using a flexibility, that exists for a specific reason outside of the reason that that flexibility exists, you just, Congress comes in and tightens that. And I think, these articles point out that Congress is already very interested in, hey, what happened here? And so I think that that's what, and I know the Army is certainly gaga over OTAs, and they're trying to use it on again outside of the traditional realm of OTAs, and they're using it to kind of, get there faster. They're using it to kind of get there without the traditional controls that are in place on contracts. And again, I agree with Don. These typically this never ends well, and it ends up closing a valid vehicle. I've issued OTAs. Way back in the day. I think Don and I both
Yeah.
have, and they were when they were being used the way that I think Congress initially intended. They were in fact very good at advancing the state of the art and getting some things in place that wouldn't have happened otherwise. When I hear OTA for vaccine development with 6 different firms done by an OTA to an intermediary whose sole job under their OTA is to issue other OTAs. That does not sound like normal
Yeah.
other transaction type stuff.
What are the options? Real quick before we move on. What are you said urgent and compelling circumstances, Jennifer. I was thinking broad agency
I thought
announcement.
that too.
What are other things? I mean, people watching this, what flexibility should they be using? Should they be aware of to help them use?
Well, I certainly think I think their broad agency announcement I think was used to some degree. Maybe not for these contracts, but for some of the other contracts. I think unusual and compelling urgency. Um, I certainly think that, I mean, some of this, and I think that this is where some of the post pandemic dissection will come into play. You know, what is the role of the federal government in pandemics? You know, I think FEMA was never intended to be a first responder up until I think Hurricane Katrina, and then suddenly they were a first responder. And so there's a number of issues, but under the and this is a flexibility that came about I think after Hurricane Katrina also. It's in FAR Part 20, I want to say 28, not 28.
The local
20,
set-asides?
yes, the local set aside. I think that I think you could make I mean, I don't know that a local set aside would apply here, but I think you could certainly make a case um, for approaching all the major vaccine developers and, you know, getting them involved, because the whole point is competition. And I mean, but if you're awarding to all of them, you know, I don't know if that's, I don't know.
Why do we even care about competition? Why is competition even an issue?
Well, the
Do you
competition.
really care about price?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think that's part of what completely fell through the cracks here, which but that typically in a broad agency announcement in the R&D, price is substantially less critical, but that's why some of those, you know, cost accounting and whatever come into play. So it will be very, I think there will be some post-pandemic dissection about how much we really did pay for these vaccines, how much the US ended up with at the end of this, you know, intellectual property wise or so on. I think there will be some interesting dissection that will come out of this after, you know, this all plays out.
To answer your question, Nick, my preference, I think, in this case would be a BAA.
That's what I thought.
You know, to just kind of advertise, we need this vaccine developed. And, you know, we'll send in your proposals and we'll fund what we can.
Do you remember that during the Manhattan Project of World War II, Union Carbide built the Oak Ridge plant for cost plus $1?
Really?
Because they thought it was their patriotic duty. And then afterwards, the auditors came in and said they underspent their budget, so they had to pay back a percentage of the dollar. That's a true story. It's a true story as reported in Leslie Grove's story of the Manhattan Project.
That's funny.
So why couldn't the country decide that saving the lives of its citizens was kind of important and invite these pharmaceutical manufacturers to come to them and partner, right? Cost plus $50, cost plus $1,000. Okay, you got to make your stockholders happy. Cost plus $1 million. Okay, but isn't it like, did anyone try that? I mean, I want to talk about this a lot if we get a chance to talk about the database thing. Why isn't the government looking to partner anymore? Why is everything arm's length and, frankly, adversarial?
I think those are valid questions, because I think that costs, having your costs paid for is in fact beneficial to these firms. I mean, they would have been developing the vaccine anyways for valid reasons. And so there's no question that could have been done this way, that the way that you suggested, other than the fact that I think there's this general thought right now that cost reimbursement is bad. But is it really worse than paying $1 billion for who knows what? Vaccine
Right.
development
Maybe we
and
should have negotiated. Maybe we should have negotiated a fixed price incentive fee with firm successive targets. Maybe that would have been the way to go. This is why they went with OTA, because somebody suggested that we can't do cost reimbursement. So we could do FPIF, and everyone went, no, thank you. Let's do OTAs.
I do
So
think that's part
what
of
kind
why
of
OTAs are so
partnering?
popular.
What kind of
Sorry.
partnering were you suggesting, Nick?
Look, Don, I mean, you guys have been around a few years, and you know what I'm talking about. When Gansler ran things, the watchword was partnership. He wanted to partner with contractors because there was a mutual goal. Yes, there were rules to the partnership, there were rules to the game, but if everyone followed the rules, the DoD in particular was looking to partner to achieve the contractual outcomes that it wanted to achieve. And when Gansler left his position, it changed, right? And now, at best, you got an arm's length sort of, you do you and I'll do me. But oftentimes it's adversarial. Contractors I deal with really believe that too many contracting officers think that they're getting credit for negotiating cost savings from a contractor that really just come out of the contractor's profit and loss statement.
Mm-hmm.
Too many. Is that a fair characterization? Probably not, but it's a widely held characterization. And I'm sure that if I queried a bunch of contracting officers, they would give me the generality that contractors are trying to rip off the government and are always looking to take advantage. Is that a true statement? In some cases, for sure, yes, but not generally. So how do you overcome this chasm that's been created in 20 years of distrust?
So you're saying in practice, you've noticed a change from like the mid 90s till today? Or just,
Yeah.
no?
Well, look, I mean, I can pull up DoD guidance documents from the Gansler era, and I'll show you exactly what I mean.
No, I know about those documents, but I'm just wondering, did that, I mean, that's the what the top is saying, like, do this, right? This is our initiative. But did that filter down to the workforce, and did they really act that way?
Well, it's always a negotiation. If as a contractor, if you opened up the DoD Pentagon guidance in front of the contracting officer and you said, let's read this together, what does it say to you? You usually got somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, it's very much, hands off, standoffish is probably a good term. I've experienced it. I don't know. What do you guys think? That's been my experience.
I agree. I mean, I think having worked starting during that mid 90, early to mid 90 period when there was an emphasis on partnership to then, to the end of my government career, I think it was certainly much more adversarial. I think some of it was as a result of the the let's not do cost reimbursement because the contractor's going to overcharge us. Let's not do that. But I think, I mean, the DoD did, or DHHS or whoever it was in this buying role did essentially accomplish more or less what Nick suggested. They contacted, they knew who they wanted to award contracts to. There's only so many firms that can develop vaccines, certainly so many American firms. And they did, in fact, award to all of them that they were aware of. And but if they would have contacted him and said, hey, or even under a BAA, I mean, I contacted people that I wanted to propose, maybe that hadn't typically proposed in the past. And as long as there was an open announcement, there was nothing wrong with that. And then just ask them, hey, can you propose a cost plus a minimal amount and let us move out on this quickly? But I think that aversion to cost reimbursement contracts is part of why there's this plethora of OTAs right now. Is it's very difficult to get a cost reimbursement contract through current management or leadership. And some of that is stemming from Congress, and some of it's stemming from, all these sensational articles about paying for the, $900 toilet seat or $400 hammer, those are the older ones, but those articles still continue today. But let's move to the last one so we can talk about that one before we run out of time. We're close to running out of time. But the last wave of the coronavirus federal government response is the government wanted to track rolling out the vaccine. And so they awarded a $44 million no bid is what the article calls it. So, sole source, obviously, of some sort to Deloitte, I think is who they awarded it to, and to track, the receipt of the vaccine and then the rollout of the vaccine. And again, a couple of other articles about this, but essentially, it's not going well. The medical firms have kind of been forced to use it. But it's supposed to track, I think, a number of things. It's supposed to track who's available for vaccine, how many doses are coming. And from what I've read is that most, the medical, like the hospitals or the healthcare centers that are using it, the only thing of value they feel they get out of it is how many doses of the vaccine they're getting. They feel like they fed the federal government the data that's in the system in the first place, and the federal government didn't get it input into the system correctly, so that it's not actually, so it's like they're paying to, like regurgitate data that they already had or know better. And so once again, we have this sole source where we rushed out and awarded, again, like when I think build a nice computer system, Deloitte is not the first firm that pops to my mind. I don't know, maybe they've done a lot of building of computer systems more recently. I always think of them as, I guess, accounting firm, but anyway, so they did a number of things to award this to them, and again, it's not going well. I think Nick can speak more coherently to this one because he's tracked this very closely from the beginning. So I'll let Nick say.
Yeah. I don't know if I've tracked it closely, but I will tell you, having worked for 10 years in the Big Four, of which Deloitte is one, they are far more than just accounting firms. And doing an ERP system, an enterprise resource planning system, is very, very much in their wheelhouse. You ever heard of the company Accenture? No. The two letters that start Accenture, AC, you know what that starts with? Anderson Consulting. Remember Arthur Anderson? Accenture doesn't want you to remember that, but it's true. So there's definitely no doubt in my mind that Deloitte has the capability. But like any major IT project, it starts with what are the requirements, right? If you can't articulate the requirements, you're never going to get a good system. And in this case, the disaster, the acquisition malpractice that ought to cost people their careers is that the government didn't buy the source code, right? The reason they have to keep going back sole source to Deloitte is because Deloitte has a proprietary source code that they've used to develop the vaccine system. I know this because on WIFCON, Vern Edwards put out the J&A for the VAMS O&M contract that went sole source to Deloitte, and it lays it out. We have to keep going back to Deloitte because they own their software and we don't. That is acquisition malpractice in my view. How can you let Deloitte bring their proprietary tools to this? And by the way, there were probably 20 companies who could have done this software development, who could have put this together. If you went to Deloitte for whatever reason, maybe they wrote a convincing management volume, right? Technical approach was the best. You had to make sure that not only did you have use rights, you actually had to buy the source code so that you could let other people run it if Deloitte didn't work out, right? So you could modify it, you could change it, because it's quite likely you weren't going to get it right on the first try because nobody could predict the future that exactly, right? I've seen so many failed software projects, and I'm sure you two have as well. And it all starts with, number one, failed requirement planning, and number two, you can't recover because you're locked into an inflexible system. So yeah, VAMS is a total failure. States are opting out of it. States are developing their own vaccine management systems and only loosely connecting with VAMS to the minimum extent they have to. And this isn't the first federal major project that's failed, right? We could go talk about the FBI. We could talk about other things in history. We could talk about the New York City payroll system that another major contractor didn't do well on. These are challenging projects for sure, and they require the greatest of care and expertise. But man, it's the kind of thing where you don't even want price to be a factor at all. You want best people who will partner with you and deliver you a system that you will own, that you will understand, and by the way, that you can modify to meet changing requirements over time. And if you haven't done all that, you haven't done your job. Sorry to be passionate about it, but that's how I feel.
Okay. Shouldn't, but isn't the requirement of the government to first determine if there are commercial products available before developing its own stuff? Or to see if a commercial product could meet its needs?
Well, in this case, maybe they did. Maybe they said, oh, Deloitte has a commercial
Well, I
product.
think I'm sure that's exactly what they did do. And I think that that's in fact part of what I was just going to say is, there's this thought process that in the commercial world, particularly with software, that modifying source code to meet however clearly or unclearly defined government need is commercially available. And what that does is it locks you into a sole source approach because without any government without intellectual property rights, but that's not how the commercial world does business. When in fact ERP is a commercial product that is regularly modified by large businesses with some, say in the source code and ability to, go elsewhere. So I think there is certainly a lack of flexibility in the commercial approach, the lack of recognition of how intellectual property in software systems is working in purely private transactions, that it's not working that way in government transactions. And so the government is overspending and resulting in these weird, it's like throwing good money after bad, once you get locked into some kind of weird system that doesn't work. it probably was a commercial contract. I mean, I'd be curious. I mean, I should have pulled up the J&A on WIFCON and then, tried to pull up the contract. But my guess is if you looked at that contract, it probably was commercially procured.
Right.
Yeah, I'll just read a little bit of it. Because BAMS is built on Deloitte's proprietary GovConnect system, Deloitte is the only contractor that is able to provide the O&M for the application. It contains Deloitte's intellectual property that's configured to support the unique needs of the CDC. Blah, blah, blah. The intellectual property is specific to Deloitte and no other vendor is able to access the product or license. Well, there you go, right? Deloitte could have walked in and bid 52 cents for the initial contract because once it was set up, they were there forever.
And frankly, whether it was a commercial item or not, it was fixed. I'm sure it was fixed price. And the way the FAR is set up is, unless it's cost reimbursement, you're locked into no government ownership or say in the intellectual property.
Do you think that?
Yeah, and I bet $1 that they was awarded to the low bid.
Do you think that they would have been better off if they didn't define their need as a software system? Like
just define the capability.
They just need a way to track. The requirement is to track who gets the vaccine and who doesn't. And they not.
Well, it's also qualified to get the
What's
vaccine.
That?
It's who's qualified to get the vaccine,
right.
Isn't it?
Right.
Well?
We just kind of state the problem. We need a way to track this. And that way we're not buying software. We're just buying a service, tracking service.
Sure, but you can't ignore the fact that it's done via software.
Fine.
Electronically.
Yeah, but
and that it has hooks into other databases, right? So you could have gone to like a Palantir, who's a database data fusion maestro, right? We didn't all know the Palantir story. You could go to them and say, do this for us. Okay. But if you're gonna do a software database solution, allowing the contractor to retain the ownership of the property and to restrict the licensure is criminally bad business management.
And I
Terrible.
think the solution would have had to have been a software solution anyways, because, is a firm gonna put a person in every doctor's office to track this? Are they going to call doctors? The doctors are, different firms are going to, in theory, they're supposed to log onto the system and track it, and so I just don't know how you could have done it as a service without it being obscenely cost prohibitive. And I don't think it would have made any difference in the source code.
We didn't give anybody a chance. I get Don's point. We didn't give anybody a chance to propose an innovative solution, right? Maybe it could have been done on Twitter.
Yeah, I'm thinking. Yeah, I'm not saying it necessarily could have been something other than software, but if the requirement is that we want this tracking, we want this data, we want to give you data, and we want this in return. If the requirement was kind of defined like that, instead of we want software, like,
okay,
I guess, yeah, they're going to use software to do it, but we just.
Yeah, you still deal with the ownership issue, Don,
right.
I feel, no matter what, you still cannot. And then I also want to mention, I read a story yesterday about these vaccines. They got plenty of vaccines on order. You know what they didn't order?
Yeah.
Syringes. Right? Did you see that same article? There's a massive shortage worldwide of syringes because Nobody had the foresight to go, oh, we're going to be delivering hundreds of millions of doses of vaccine. How are we going to do that exactly?
Well, apparently you can just tell the
Right?
VA that you've got them in stock and you'll get a contract. So,
Well, yeah, but yeah, would you accept Chinese syringes? I mean, just look, I feel like the anger that I'm feeling now is going to continue the more people find out about this stuff. It's going to come out and it's going to change acquisition rules as a result. 3, 4, 5 years from now, there's going to be a new Congress, and they're going to have a new investigation, and there's going to be hearings, and there's going to be a bunch of stuff that comes out about this. And I hope it's not a typical congressional overreaction to it, but I suspect it will be.
what was the website that failed
This is
with
bad.
Obamacare?
Yes, the Obama.
What was
Remember
that?
that?
What was
I
that
remember
website?
that.
Health.gov or something like that, or healthcare.gov?
Yeah, no, I thought of
I don't
that
know, but
right
you're absolutely
immediately.
right. So this is not the first. It won't be the last until somebody fundamentally takes a different approach to acquiring whatever it is that they need to solve their problems. Whether it's Don's approach, tell me, here's my problem, tell me how you're going to solve it, which would be amazing. Or if it's my approach that says, whatever your answer is, make sure you own it, government, so that nobody can hold you hostage for the next 10 years. I don't know. It's not right. This is not reflecting well on the acquisition workforce.
Yeah. All right. Any closing comments?
I think I made mine.
Okay.
I think that's mine too. I think people kind of go crazy in an emergency, and by people, I mean the acquisition workforce. They rush out thinking that they're being a first responder, and somehow, it's like the fog of war. They just don't follow prudent due diligence, and then we end up overpaying, or we end up with products that don't work, or contracts to fraudulent people. And I think that's the undercurrent of all of these articles is, we've paid for stuff that didn't exist. We didn't do due diligence when we should have. We used some kind of weird OTA to an intermediary to get these vaccines developed, and it's completely unclear what we own and what we don't own, and how this is going to play out in the long term, with these large vaccine developers. And now we have a system that we paid for that isn't hardly usable. So I think
Yeah.
the acquisition workforce just cut too many corners in trying to respond.
Yeah. Well, there's no shortage of people willing to take advantage of the government when they're desperate. You guys know where the word shoddy came from? Shoddy was a material that shyster contractors used to make uniforms during the Civil War. So they would give them this material made of shoddy and it would basically disintegrate, within days. So it was actually a noun before it became an adjective. So now,
Wow. Didn't know that. Learned something.
all right. Well, Acquivores, thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next week, and no, 2 weeks from now. Sorry, and keep up the good work.